The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, steady and low, like a giant softly purring. Outside, the morning sun spread its golden light across the airport tarmac, making the planes gleam. Passengers were finding their seats, placing bags in the overhead bins, and settling in for the journey ahead. The air inside the cabin smelled faintly of metal and cleaning spray, mingled with the warm aroma of coffee from a nearby passenger's cup. The soft murmur of conversations floated through the air as travelers spoke quietly to each other, their voices blending into a peaceful hum. Among the passengers was a mother. Her name was Sarah. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from juggling too many responsibilities. Her brown eyes carried a mix of weariness and determination. In one hand, she held a carry-on bag that seemed far heavier than it needed to be. In her other arm, she balanced her young son, who squirmed and twisted as if sitting still was the hardest thing in the world. His curly hair bounced as he tried to peek over his mother's shoulder, curious about everything around him. Sarah wore simple clothes, a pair of jeans, a plain t-shirt, and sneakers. Her face, though lined with exhaustion, held a kind and calm expression. She had one of those warm smiles that could make you feel at ease, even on a stressful day. She leaned down to whisper softly to her son, who had begun to fuss, and he calmed down, resting his head against her shoulder. Even in this chaotic moment, Sarah had an air of quiet strength about her. As Sarah made her way to her assigned seat, she managed to keep a gentle smile on her face. Her mind was racing, though. She had been traveling for hours, hopping between flights, and keeping her son entertained along the way. Her body was aching, and she wanted nothing more than to sit down, close her eyes, and breathe for a moment. But she kept her focus on her son, trying to make the trip easier for him. The row Sarah was assigned to had 3 seats, and her spot was by the window. She carefully squeezed past the other passengers already seated and placed her carry-on bag in the overhead bin. Then, with her son still in her arms, she slid into her seat, grateful for a moment of rest. She gently set her son down on her lap, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. He giggled, and she chuckled softly, her spirits lifting for just a moment. The cabin began to grow quieter as more passengers found their places. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, checking seat belts and offering polite smiles. The sound of the engines grew louder, a sign that the plane was getting ready for takeoff. The excitement and nervous energy in the cabin were almost tangible. Sarah took a deep breath, letting herself relax for the first time in hours. She looked out the window at the bright sky, her son now distracted by a small toy he had pulled from his pocket. She thought about how far she had come, how hard she worked every day to give her child a better life. Life wasn't always easy, but she was proud of the love and care she poured into her family. That thought gave her strength. Suddenly, a voice broke through her thoughts. It was a sharp, slightly annoyed tone. "Excuse me, ma'am," the voice said. Sarah turned to see a flight attendant standing beside her row. The woman's uniform was perfectly pressed, her expression polite but not warm. "I believe you're in the wrong seat." Sarah blinked in surprise. She glanced down at her ticket and then back at the flight attendant. "This is my seat," she said calmly, holding out her ticket for the woman to see. The flight attendant leaned in, studying the ticket with a tight-lipped expression. For a moment, there was silence. Other passengers began to glance over, their curiosity piqued by the interaction. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, and her son shifted uneasily in her lap, sensing her tension. The flight attendant frowned slightly. "Well, I'll need to double-check this," she said, her tone clipped. She walked away briskly, leaving Sarah sitting there, confused and a little embarrassed. She glanced around the cabin, trying to ignore the stares of the passengers nearby. She couldn't shake the feeling that the flight attendant's attitude wasn't about the ticket. There was something else behind it, something unspoken but very present. Still, Sarah held her head high. She wasn't about to let one moment ruin her day or the trip she had worked so hard to plan. She turned her attention back to her son, tickling his side to make him giggle again. His laughter was like a small light in the moment, easing her nerves. Before we move forward, take a moment to think about this. Have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you? How did it make you feel? Did you rise above it or let it weigh you down? Let us know in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else. As Sarah waited, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Whatever it was, she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let anyone take away her dignity or her strength. She had faced challenges before, and she would face this one, too. The plane hadn't even left the ground yet, but Sarah's journey was already taking a turn she hadn't expected. The cabin was filled with the soft hum of the airplane engines. Passengers were settling into their seats, stowing bags in overhead bins, and chatting quietly. Sarah had just buckled her seat belt, her son now distracted with a toy car he'd been playing with. She leaned her head back against the seat, feeling the exhaustion from a long day of traveling. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the relative calm of the cabin. "Excuse me, ma'am," the voice said, loud and clear. Sarah looked up, startled. Standing in the aisle was a flight attendant. Her uniform was neat, and her posture was straight, but her expression was anything but friendly. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and her tone was cool. "I think you're in the wrong seat," the flight attendant said, holding a clipboard close to her chest. Her words were polite, but there was something about the way she said them that didn't feel right. Sarah blinked, surprised by the accusation. She glanced at her ticket, then back at the flight attendant. "This is my seat," Sarah said calmly, holding up her ticket so the flight attendant could see it. "I double-checked before sitting down." The flight attendant leaned closer to look at the ticket, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't say anything for a moment, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Sarah noticed the flight attendant's eyes flicker to her and her son, lingering for just a second too long. It wasn't just the words or the actions, it was the feeling behind them. There was something about the way the flight attendant looked at her, like she didn't belong. Other passengers were starting to notice. Heads turned, curious eyes landing on Sarah and her son. She could feel the weight of their stares. Her son looked up at her, sensing her discomfort, and clutched his toy car a little tighter. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his back and kept her voice steady. "This is my seat," Sarah repeated, her tone still polite but firm. "If there's a mistake, I'm happy to check, but I'm certain this is correct." The flight attendant pursed her lips and straightened up. "I'll have to verify this," she said, her voice louder this time. She turned and walked briskly up the aisle, leaving Sarah sitting there, confused and uncomfortable. The murmurs of the other passengers grew louder. Sarah could hear snippets of whispered conversations. What's going on? Did she take someone else's seat? Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm, but she kept her composure. She had been in situations like this before, moments when people made assumptions about her or treated her differently for reasons they never said out loud. It hurt, but she wasn't going to let it show. She looked down at her son, who was watching her closely. "It's okay," she said softly, stroking his hair. "Everything's going to be fine." Minutes later, the flight attendant returned, this time with another staff member. The second person, a man in a similar uniform, glanced at Sarah and then at the ticket in her hand. He spoke quietly to the flight attendant, who shook her head and gestured toward Sarah. Their voices were low, but the tension was clear. Sarah could feel it building, not just in the staff but in the passengers around her. The flight attendant turned back to Sarah, her tone sharper now. "Are you sure this is your seat, ma'am? We have other passengers boarding, and we need to resolve this quickly." Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm sure," she said. I followed the ticket and sat where I was assigned. Is there a reason you think I shouldn't be here? The flight attendant's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, she didn't answer. Instead, she glanced again at Sarah's son, who was now holding tightly to his mother's hand. The pause was brief, but it was enough for Sarah to feel the unspoken judgment in the air. She felt a mix of frustration and sadness rising inside her. This wasn't just about a seat anymore, it was about something deeper. The flight attendant finally spoke, her tone clipped. "I'll check again," she said, before walking away once more. Sarah let out a quiet sigh, trying to steady herself. She felt the stares of the other passengers like a heavy weight on her shoulders. A few people looked sympathetic, but others seemed annoyed, as if they blamed her for the delay. Her son tugged on her sleeve, his small voice breaking through the tension. "Mommy, are we in trouble?" Sarah shook her head quickly. "No, baby," she said, her voice soft but steady. "We're not in trouble. Everything's okay." But inside, Sarah felt far from okay. She hated how exposed and vulnerable she felt, sitting there with everyone watching. She hated that her son had to see her being treated this way. But she also knew she couldn't let the situation defeat her. She straightened her back and took a deep breath, determined to stay calm. When the flight attendant returned, she was still holding the clipboard, but this time her expression was different. She seemed irritated, almost frustrated. "It looks like this is your seat after all," she said, her tone lacking any apology. "But please make sure you're seated correctly next time." The word stung, and Sarah felt a flash of anger. She had been seated correctly all along, and yet she was the one being blamed. But she didn't let the anger show. She simply nodded and said, "Thank you." She knew that losing her temper wouldn't help, especially with her son watching. As the flight attendant walked away, Sarah noticed a few passengers looking at her with kind expressions. One woman, seated across the aisle, leaned over and said quietly, "You handled that so well. I don't think I could have stayed that calm." Sarah gave a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady, but inside, she felt exhausted. The rest of the boarding process continued, but the incident lingered in the air. Sarah could still feel the occasional glance from other passengers, and she wondered what they were thinking. Did they believe she had done something wrong? Or did they see what had really happened? As the plane prepared for takeoff, Sarah looked out the window. The sky was a soft shade of blue, the kind that seemed endless. She thought about how often she had faced moments like this, moments where she had to prove herself, where she had to stay strong even when it felt unfair. She thought about her son and the example she wanted to set for him. She turned to him and smiled, brushing a curl away from his forehead. "See? Everything's okay," she said. "We're right where we're supposed to be. What about you? Have you ever been in a situation like this? What would you have done if you were in Sarah's shoes? Share your thoughts below. Your story might inspire someone else." The plane was in the air now, cruising smoothly through the clouds. Sarah's son had finally fallen asleep in her arms, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. But Sarah couldn't relax. The earlier incident with the flight attendant kept playing in her mind. She had felt humiliated and singled out, and she wasn't sure why. Something about the way the flight attendant had treated her didn't sit right. As Sarah stared out the window, she noticed a woman across the aisle leaning toward her. The woman, who looked to be in her 50s, had kind eyes and a gentle smile. "I saw what happened earlier," the woman said softly, careful not to wake Sarah's son. "That wasn't right." Sarah nodded, her voice quiet. "It's okay," she said, though it wasn't really okay. "These things happen." The woman shook her head firmly. "No, it's not okay. I've flown a lot, and I've seen that flight attendant act like that before. You didn't deserve that." Her words made Sarah pause. Before, she asked. You've seen her do this to other people? The woman nodded. Not to me, but I've seen her give others a hard time. It's always the same kind of person, two people who don't look like her. Sarah's heart sank at those words. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach turn. She thought about all the other people who might have been treated unfairly, people who might not have spoken up or had anyone to support them. She thought about how her son had watched the entire interaction and how she wanted him to grow up in a world where kindness and fairness mattered. Before Sarah could respond, a young man sitting a few rows ahead turned around. He held up his phone. I recorded what happened, he said, his voice low but steady. I didn't like how she treated you. If you want the video, it's yours. Sarah was surprised by the offer. You recorded it? She asked, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. The man nodded. Yeah. I didn't think it was right. She was way out of line. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Thank you, she said. That means a lot. The man smiled and promised to send her the video as soon as the plane landed. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't just about her. Maybe this was about something bigger. She decided she wasn't going to let the incident go unnoticed. She wasn't going to let her son think it was okay to be treated poorly or to treat others poorly. When the plane landed and everyone began gathering their belongings, the woman across the aisle spoke up again. I think you should report this, she said. You seem like a strong person. Maybe you can make a difference. Sarah smiled at the woman, her resolve growing stronger. I think I will, she said. As Sarah exited the plane with her son, the young man with the video walked beside her. Are you going to do something with the video? He asked. Sarah nodded. I think so, she said. I need to look into it first, but I think this might be part of a bigger problem. The man handed her a piece of paper with his contact information. If you need me to speak up about what I saw, I'm happy to help, he said. Sarah thanked him, feeling a sense of community forming around her. She wasn't alone in this. There were others who saw what had happened and wanted to help. That evening, after putting her son to bed, Sarah sat down at her laptop. She decided to look up reviews for the airline and see if anyone else had experienced something similar. As she scrolled through the comments, she began to notice a pattern. There were multiple complaints about a flight attendant matching the description of the woman who had confronted her. Passengers had written about being spoken to rudely, treated unfairly, or even ignored completely. One comment caught Sarah's attention. I've flown with this airline many times, but this one flight attendant made me feel invisible. She treated other passengers with respect but acted like I didn't belong there. Another passenger had written, I was traveling with my elderly mother, and the same flight attendant gave us such a hard time. I couldn't understand why we were being singled out. Sarah felt a mix of anger and determination. It wasn't just her. This was a pattern, a problem that had gone unaddressed for too long. She thought about what she could do. She wasn't just a passenger, she was also a journalist. She knew how to dig for the truth and how to make people pay attention to important issues. She opened her email and began writing to the airline's customer service department. She described her experience, included details from the other complaints she had found, and attached the video the young man had sent her. She ended the email with a clear request, this kind of behavior is unacceptable. I hope your airline will take this seriously and ensure no one else has to experience what I did. Over the next few days, Sarah received responses from people who had heard about the incident. The woman from the flight emailed her, offering more details about what she had seen. The young man who recorded the video checked in to make sure she had everything she needed. Even strangers who read about her story online reached out with words of encouragement. You're doing the right thing, one email said. Thank you for standing up for yourself and for others. Another message read, "I've faced similar situations, and it's hard to speak up. You're inspiring so many people by not staying silent." These messages gave Sarah strength. She still had moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if she was making too much of the situation. But every time she looked at her son, she reminded herself why this mattered. She wanted him to grow up knowing that people could make a difference, even in the face of unfairness. As Sarah continued to work on her story, she began to see how the incident reflected larger societal issues. It wasn't just about one flight attendant or one airline. It was about how people treated each other, about the assumptions they made, and about the importance of speaking up when something wasn't right. She thought about the passengers who had supported her, the woman who had spoken up, the man who had recorded the video, and the strangers who had sent her messages. Their kindness reminded her that change was possible, especially when people came together. Have you ever faced prejudice or injustice? How did you rise above it? Share your story below. Your experience could inspire someone else to find their strength. The cabin was filled with a heavy silence as Sarah stood her ground. She was no longer tired, no longer afraid. She had her son sitting quietly beside her, and the video in her hand was the truth she needed to prove her point. Around her, a few passengers who had supported her earlier were nodding in agreement, giving her courage. The flight attendant, the same one who had accused her of sitting in the wrong seat, stood in front of her now. The woman's polite mask was gone. Her face looked tense, and her voice, once sharp and commanding, had softened but still carried a defensive edge. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, forcing a smile. "I believe we've already sorted this out. There's no need to cause a scene." Sarah took a deep breath, her voice steady and calm. "I'm not trying to cause a scene," she said. "I just want to make sure no one else is treated the way I was. What you did wasn't right." The flight attendant's smile faltered, but she tried to stand her ground. "I was only doing my job," she said, though her tone was less certain now. "It's important to follow procedures." Sarah held up her phone. The video, recorded by the young man earlier, showed the whole incident. In it, the flight attendant's tone, her dismissive gestures, and the way she spoke to Sarah were clear. Sarah's calm responses and polite insistence on fairness were also evident. "I have proof," Sarah said. "And I'm not the only one who's experienced this. There are others who've said the same thing about you. This isn't about following procedures, it's about treating people with respect." The passengers around them were paying attention now. Some of them murmured in agreement. A man a few rows back spoke up. "She's right," he said. "I saw the way you treated her. It wasn't okay." Another passenger, the older woman who had supported Sarah earlier, added, "I've flown many times, and I've never seen someone treated the way she was. It's not right." The flight attendant glanced around, her confidence visibly shaken. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The support for Sarah was growing, and it was clear that the truth was out. The airline manager, alerted by the growing commotion, arrived at the scene. He was a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between Sarah and the flight attendant. Sarah explained the situation clearly, showing the video and sharing what had happened. She spoke calmly but firmly, making sure her words were simple and clear. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about making sure everyone is treated fairly." The manager watched the video, his expression turning serious. He turned to the flight attendant, his tone professional but firm. "We'll need to talk about this," he said. "This isn't how we expect our staff to behave." The flight attendant's face went pale. She mumbled something about doing her best, but the manager cut her off gently. "We'll discuss this later," he said. "For now, please return to your duties." The flight attendant walked away, her shoulders slumped. The atmosphere in the cabin felt lighter, as if a storm had passed. The incident didn't end on the plane. After landing, the young man who had recorded the video shared it with Sarah, who decided to post it online. She didn't do it to embarrass anyone but to raise awareness about the importance of treating everyone with respect. The video quickly gained attention. People from all over the world watched it, shared their thoughts, and added their own stories of similar experiences. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, it became a topic of conversation everywhere. The airline responded by issuing an apology to Sarah and promising to conduct a thorough review of their staff training and policies. "We take these matters seriously," their statement read. "We are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with dignity and respect." But Sarah didn't stop there. She used the attention to talk about the bigger issues behind what had happened. She shared her story and encouraged others to speak up when they faced unfair treatment. She reached out to organizations that worked for equality and fairness, offering to help in any way she could. For Sarah, the experience was both painful and empowering. She had doubted herself at times, wondering if she should just let the incident go. But the support of the passengers, the young man's video, and her own inner strength had helped her see the importance of standing up for what was right. Her son, now old enough to understand some of what had happened, asked her one evening, "Mommy, why did that lady act like that?" Sarah thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes people make mistakes," she said. "Sometimes they forget how to treat others kindly. But when that happens, it's important to speak up, not to hurt them, but to help them do better." Her son nodded, his small face serious. "You were very brave, Mommy." Sarah smiled, her heart full. "Thank you, sweetheart. And you can be brave, too. Always remember to be kind and to stand up for what's right. Now it's your turn to think, how can we hold people accountable while promoting understanding? How can we make sure everyone is treated with respect and kindness, no matter who they are? Share your ideas below. Your thoughts could make a difference. The antagonist faces consequences. A week after the flight, Sarah received an email from the airline. They apologized again for how she had been treated and promised they were taking the matter seriously. They said the flight attendant had been removed from duty for further training and evaluation. "We want to assure you," the email said, "that this behavior does not reflect the values of our airline. We are working to improve our training to ensure all passengers are treated fairly and respectfully." It wasn't just an empty promise. A few days later, the airline announced new plans to train its staff on how to handle situations with respect and kindness. They even invited Sarah to share her story at one of their workshops. She agreed, knowing it was a chance to make a difference. The flight attendant, meanwhile, sent Sarah a personal letter. It was short but sincere. "I realize now that my behavior was wrong," the letter said. "I am sorry for the way I treated you. I am learning from this experience and hope to do better in the future." Sarah read the letter twice. She felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and hope. While the flight attendant's apology didn't erase the pain of the moment, it was a step toward healing. More importantly, it was proof that people could change if they were willing to listen and learn. For Sarah, the experience had been hard, but it also made her stronger. She had faced an uncomfortable and unfair situation, but she had stood her ground. She had spoken up not just for herself but for others who might face the same treatment. Sarah decided to use her voice for good. She began working with groups that focused on equality and fairness, sharing her story to inspire others to speak out. She wanted people to know they weren't alone, that their voices mattered. One day, as Sarah was packing her son's lunch for school, he asked, "Mommy, are you still helping people with the airplane story?" She smiled at him. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm trying to help people understand how important it is to treat everyone kindly." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's good, Mommy. You're helping the world be better." Her heart swelled with pride. "I hope so," she said, hugging him tightly. As Sarah became more involved in her advocacy, she started to notice patterns. The incident on the flight wasn't an isolated event. She learned about other stories where people had been treated unfairly, not just on airplanes but in schools, workplaces, and public spaces. It was clear there was more work to do. Sarah began writing about these issues, using her platform to raise awareness. Her articles were simple but powerful, focusing on kindness, fairness, and the importance of standing up for others. People from all over the world reached out to thank her for sharing her message. One message stood out to her. It was from a young woman who had faced discrimination at her job. "Your story gave me the courage to speak up," the woman wrote. "Thank you for reminding me that my voice matters." Sarah said.